Steph, you can hear me come through, right?
Yes.
Okay, cool. All right, cool. Welcome everyone on this lovely spring evening. My name is Allie Mullen and I'm with the Oswego Lake Watershed Council. And you are here tonight to hear from Steph Littlebird about a lot of things actually, but one of them being her work curating the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibition that has been up in the Five Oaks Museum since 2020. And it can currently be viewed at the Pittock Mansion. If you are a brand new guest here tonight and haven't heard of the Oswego Lake Watershed Council, we are a locally organized stewardship nonprofit established to improve the condition and health of the Oswego Lake watershed and its stream network. And I just want to add that as a land-based organization, we have to acknowledge that there have been other ways of ecological knowing that have been historically excluded from the Western scientific worldview, which has informed a lot of our existing land stewardship practices in Lake Oswego. And that in a lot of ways, Western science is catching up with Native knowledge. And our awareness of the present environmental conditions of the land we work on depends a lot on how we are listening to other voices, past, present, and future. I am currently in Northeast Portland, but I work in Lake Oswego, and both of those cities are located on the colonized lands of the Atfalati Kalapuyans, also known as the Tualatin Band of the Kalapuyans, the Clackamas Band of the Upper Chinook, and other Native groups who were the first stewards and first inhabitants of the Willamette Valley. And their descendants are represented today by the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and other indigenous groups. Indigenous people successfully lived and cared for this land since time immemorial, prior to European colonization, and continue to do so today. And we acknowledge and mourn the loss of life and a way of living in harmony of all creation. And we seek to respectfully listen, learn, and apply indigenous knowledge to the healing of the land and all beings who interact with the Oswego Lake watershed. So just a couple of housekeeping items to share before I turn it over to our speaker. We are recording this talk and it'll be sent out to everyone who has registered for this event. So if you end up missing any chunk of tonight or want to come back to it, that recording will be available. And then tonight's talk will also be followed up by a Q&A with Steph. So as you're listening in, you can input your questions into the chat. And then finally, this event is sponsored by the the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, who provides grants to organizations to support urban conservation and education. Okay, I've been talking too much. Our host and speaker tonight is the one and only Steph Littlebird. She is an indigenous artist, writer, and curator, and her works frequently engage issues related to present-day indigenous identities, marginalized histories, and responsible land stewardship. And she's done so much important work to make sure that the diverse and resilient indigenous community voices of Portland and the Willamette Valley are represented in the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibition. So I'll go ahead and let Steph talk more about her background and work. And yeah, I'll just turn it over to you, Steph.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allie, and hello to everyone this evening. I'm so honored to be with you, and thank you for giving up some of your time. I'm sure, you know, you could be anywhere and you're here with me, so I appreciate it. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And just again, introduce myself. I'm Steph Littlebird, and I am the curator of This is Kalapuyan Land. And tonight I'm going to be sort of telling you about the exhibition itself, but through that you will learn a bit about the Kalapuyan people of the Willamette Valley and some of the ways in which we lived our daily lives and the materials and resources that were most important to us. And so I was reading about the Watershed Council and some of the interests, so I'm excited to chat with you about, you know, oak savannas and how we actually engineered the landscape. So I'm excited to be here this evening and share with you. So let me tell you first, though, just a little bit about the Five Oaks Museum. They were originally a settler museum that was sort of, celebrating the Oregon Trail era. They have a whole covered wagon in their archives, and basically became sort of repository for many of the families that came through on the Oregon Trail and ended up in Washington County. So they were originally called the Washington County Museum, and back in 2019, and actually that was when the show This is Kalapuyan Land opened as well. Same year, they rebranded to be the Five Oaks Museum. And so Five Oaks is in reference to the historical Five Oaks site that's in Hillsboro, Oregon. It's actually right off of Highway 26 and Brookwood Parkway. But there's like a historical trade site, and what was formerly an oak savanna. And so there is still one remaining elder oak from the Five Oaks still standing there. And there's actually some historical signage and stuff about it. It's really cool, but that's what the museum is named for. And sort of their rebranding with that came a refocus on what they wanted the museum to really be about. And so now it's much more about promoting, awareness of communities within the community that it serves that have been underrepresented. And so they started with This is Kalapuyan Land as that first sort of jump into new content when they transformed into the Five Oaks Museum. And so it originally opened as like a, your standard sort of gallery museum exhibition, as you can see in the 2019 image. And then when it closed, we had it documented and then created an online exhibition on the Five Oaks Museum website. So you can actually look at everything in really high detail if you want to see all of the panels that I edited. And so what I should also say is that This is Kalapuyan Land actually existed as a historical exhibition prior to me coming to the museum. And so I'll tell you a little bit about that. But basically, it kind of started growing and it's just turned into this thing that's like way bigger than me or anyone else could have ever predicted. And so another way that it came sort of more into the community is through the yard sign campaign. We call it MOP, or Museum at Our Place. And so different organizations can get collections of these signs, which have This is Kalapuyan Land on one side, and then information, QR codes that give them details about the people who lived on the land, and the people who are remain, who are descendants of those people. And so the show is really cool. It's this it's history, but it's also including artwork from contemporary indigenous artists in Oregon. So it really talks about the community as a whole and how we exist today as well. And so it's a beautiful sort of bridge between history and art as well. And I think that's part of what made it so successful. One second, move my slide forward here. So as I mentioned, the exhibition actually existed before I came to the museum. It was made 15 years prior to me coming to Five Oaks to see it. And when they sort of were changing over, they were like, well, this is one of our most popular exhibitions, and it's about my tribe, the Otfality Kalapuyans, which are the northernmost Kalapuyans of all of those bands. And they basically were like, do we throw it in a garbage? Like, what do we do with this? Is it worth keeping? And so what we did is we actually kept these panels that were funded by the Grand Ronde Confederated Tribes, but they were not consulted in their creation. So there are many errors, and also just a lot of like really painful sort of biases that were apparent by anyone who's reading it. So anyway, it was my job as a curator of this exhibition to not only bring native artwork in like a traditional curator would, but would also be to curate the information itself. And so I worked with our tribal scholar David Lewis, who is a professor down at University of Oregon, and he is basically the foremost expert on Pacific Northwest tribes, and specifically the Willamette Valley tribes and the Kalapuyans. And so we worked to correct the errors in the exhibition, and I literally wrote over things with a Sharpie. And so I think that's part of what also makes the exhibition really interesting, is that I went into a museum and wrote over their panels. And so that's something that you just don't do. It's a no-no, but it also teaches people to think about the idea that maybe institutions don't always get it right, and that we have to be open to critique and learning from our mistakes, instead of, say, covering them up and throwing away the exhibition and starting brand new, right? Through this, we can kind of see the process of making an error and fixing an error. And I think that's really beautiful, that a lot of times we don't really get to see the process of rectifying our mistakes, right? So I think that also is what makes this exhibition so powerful. All right, so I'm going to show you some of the panels in the exhibition and kind of deep dive into a little bit of each section of the exhibition and give you a little taste. Remember that it is up now at Pittock Mansion, and it's actually open through July 23rd. So if you want to see this stuff in person, go check it out there. And also there's a whole new collection of artworks with this exhibition. So I'm going to show you some works from the original exhibition, but if you go to Pittock Mansion, there's all brand new works. All right, so this was one of the very first sort of introductory panels, and it talks about the different territories of tribes that existed prior to colonization. And so you'll see on the panels, there's all kinds of words struck out or words highlighted, and sort of that's me going in there and emphasizing language or striking out language that's offensive, like the word Indian. It's something that younger generations of Native people don't really like that word, whereas elders sometimes will use that word a lot more. The younger generation just doesn't appreciate that word. It is considered a slur. And so if you're ever wondering, what the appropriate way to refer to Indigenous person would be, Native, Indigenous, or if you know their tribe, you can call them by their tribal name as well. So that way you're always safe and in the clear. You don't offend anybody if you don't use the word Indian. So but if you zoom in on the panel, this is actually a better illustration than the original map. So I wanted to show you the Willamette Valley, so that way you can kind of see there's so many different bands of Kalapuyan people. And what that means is that we are genetically linked, but actually most of the tribes have their own distinct dialect. And so Tualatin Kalapuyas or the Otfalati Kalapuyas have their own language compared to, say, the Santiam. And so it's a very, very diverse area. The Willamette Valley is a very special place in the world because of its sort of abundance in terms of the land and what it can support life-wise. And that is why you see such a diversity of tribes in the area, because it was such a wonderful and luscious place to live, as it remains today. All right, so if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see where I crossed out the word Indian. I also crossed out the word old. I am very sensitive about the way that Native people are depicted, and that's a lot of the reason why I brought in contemporary artwork. Was a lot of people don't know that Natives are still here, that we exist in today's communities. One of the very first student questions we got when the exhibition opened in 2019 was, do Native Americans have cell phones? And so that tells you the gap between, what people know about us and what is actually real. And so taking out things like the word old, because it's Oregon territory and it's still our tribal territory. We remain stewards of the land. And so emphasizing the present tense is really important for me throughout the exhibition. There's the word Willamette. This is a rumor I love to dispel whenever I can. Growing up as a Native person, I was asked many times, does the Willamette valley mean the valley of death? And I can assure you that no, it does not. The word Willamette actually comes from the word Willamette, which means water spilling over, or to spill or pour water. And so if you know about the Willamette Falls, then you know that they are only second to Niagara Falls in the whole entire country. They're very powerful and very important to our community, as well as many other tribal communities in the region. So the falls are really what the Willamette Valley is named for. And so that way you can go forth and dispel those myths if you ever hear them out in the world, because as an adult, people are less likely to ask me that question, but I know that it still exists out there. All right, so along with the panels, like I said, we incorporated art, and actually there is a piece from this artist in the new exhibition as well, and her name is Angelica Trimble Yanu, and she is Oglala Lakota. At the time of the exhibition, she was living in Oregon. She went to the Pacific Northwest College of Arts in downtown Portland, and now she's in LA making artwork down there, but her work is about her own community, but she lives in a completely different landscape than the Willamette Valley. She comes from North Dakota, and so the landscape there is obviously very different. And so her work is very much about her connection to the land. And most Indigenous people have what's called place-based identity. And what that means is that our identity is inherently like tied to the land and its cycles. And so much of the work that we make is related to the land in some way, because it plays such an important role in our community and in our way of life. And so I always love to share, if we can, see an artist at work. This is Angelica, and she's actually photographing her work. And these are prints. If you're familiar with printmaking, these are what are called monotypes. And so she makes these prints on paper, and sometimes they stay as a two-dimensional object in a frame, but sometimes she actually folds them up into beautiful sculptures. And I just love this piece because now, if you're looking at it, you can see where the image that she was creating in the first slide, it's like, oh, this is a reference to her home. This is the land that she's from. That's what this is referencing. And so it's a beautiful sort of tie into that idea of our place-based identity. And the way that Angelica describes these pieces is really beautiful. So I would love to share this quote with you. One word in the Lakota language is special to Angelica. The word Layeska means interpreter between two worlds. Sometimes a Layeska translates between the spiritual world and the human world, or a Layeska can be communicate between the Lakota world and the settler world. Art can be a type of Layeska. And so I love that idea of walking in two worlds. It's something that I think a lot of Indigenous people kind of feel. I know that I do as a Native person. I am representing my community all the time, but I'm also like, I live in Las Vegas currently. So I am, I'm in the world, and it's not, I can't, be in my community all the time. And so I'm always sort of balancing the very unique sort of values that come from being an Indigenous person with my life working with people who are non-Native, who don't have the same values or come from the same cultural experience. And so we're always sort of trying to balance those things, I think. And it's something that you see as a common thread in a lot of Native people's work, is that walking in two worlds. All right, so the next set of panels that are in the exhibition relate to resources, and I think that this will be of great interest to you guys. And so each of the panels sort of dives into different parts of our lives in terms of like our trade and the different resources. But I also love this because this section sort of talks about the ways that we were much more developed and sophisticated than our history books might like to remember us. And so I love talking about this aspect, what we call our life ways. And so these are the ways in which we live our lives, but indigenous lifeways are unique to our community. So one of the very first sort of traditional things that we were banned from doing that became illegal when they started passing laws against us was controlled burns. And so one of the ways in which we have managed the landscape since time immemorial is through controlled burns. And, there are many reasons why we use controlled burns to manage the land. The first, obviously, is, it enriches the soil. So we all know that, placing that carbon back into the soil is enriching and helps plants grow stronger the next year. But what other things that burning the soil or burning the grass off of the soil or the fuel, I should say, is that it will, one, minimize wildfires, because then there's no more fuel to burn on the bottom, right? And it's way harder to burn a tree than it is to burn grass, right? So it also controls bugs. If there's bug problems, usually bugs like ticks and things like that, they love tall grass. So if you burn the tall grass, you get rid of bugs, control that sort of stuff, especially if it's near any sort of resource that you might be wanting to protect, whether it be food or some other type of abundance like oak trees. And so another reason we did this was to control the spread of fir trees. Doug firs are an icon on the Oregon landscape, I think, but they are actually very invasive in the way that they will take over a forest. And so if you don't control fir reproduction, you will get what are called fir deserts, where the only thing that grows are fir trees and they sort of snuff out everything below them. And so we would do controlled burns to control those saplings. And also we would do controlled burns for oak savannas. So, oak savannas, which are a unique sort of feature of Pacific Northwest tribes in the Willamette Valley, is that we would essentially cultivate these things that don't exist in nature at oak savannas, where oaks were allowed to sort of flourish and grow abundantly so that we could visit them each year and collect their acorns. And so like the Five Oaks of the Five Oaks Museum, these places where these oaks were allowed to grow gigantic I think they're like, one of them's like 500 years old, the last one that's standing. So it tells you that, these trees can grow for a really long time and produce a ton of fruits. And so if we could maintain the landscape around them, then we would enable them to grow bigger and produce more year over year. And so that is one of the other, important sort of connections to the controlled burns, is that, we're sort of actively managing the landscape. And that's something that people don't really know about indigenous lifeways, because, there's the hunter-gatherer myth that we were just sort of at the mercy of the land, I guess. But in all actuality, we weren't. We were actively managing it. I learned this just the other day, that the Amazon rainforest is an engineered landscape, and that the indigenous people are the reason why the rainforest even exists, is because they actively engineered that forest to be abundant for their people. And so, this is a practice that exists in many cultures, not just, indigenous people of North America. Another resource that's really important to many Pacific Northwest tribes, not just the Kalapuyans, is camas. I just did a sketch of this for our historian David yesterday, and so I'm like, oh, they're blooming right now, or they're getting ready to bloom. Everyone's sort of waiting for them to pop. I've seen some really beautiful first buds in the last week on Facebook, so keep an eye out, because they're out now. But they're typically sort of found in like lower lying grasslands, not in water, but some near areas that have enough water to support a plant with a bulb at the bottom of it. So it has a bulb, and we would actually harvest these each year. and harvest it specifically for the bulb at the bottom, which if you roast it, it tastes a lot like garlic. It's delicious. And actually, this plant is related to asparagus, which I just recently found out, which is interesting. I think when you look at the very top where all of the flowers come from, it totally looks like the top of an asparagus. But anyway, the camas is an important part of our first foods that we collected each year. And these camas patches that you actually can find throughout the Willamette Valley were originally engineered patches that we would harvest and actively cultivate to bring more back to us each year. So in the indigenous community, there's a concept called the 7 generations. And that means that we make decisions thinking about the 7 generations that come after us. And we are essentially managing the land, not just for ourselves, but for our descendants. And so that's why we have all of these sort of engineered landscapes in Oregon from indigenous people, because, you know, we were planning on being here a real long time. And so we wanted to make sure that our descendants were, you know, taken care of as well. Here is actually an image of one of our elders digging camas, and if you see in her hand, she has what's called a cupping stick, and each person in the tribe would have their own that they would use to dig, and basically these just help to break up the soil so that you can get the bulb out of the soil easily. And basically you have a stick that's sort of cut to your size, and then at the very top of it would be usually an antler or something that you can use as a handle to sort of turn as you're breaking up the soil. And this is something that we still do each year, and actually working with Portland Metro to restore a lot of what used to be camas patches. So it's very exciting that there's a pretty, you know, wide-ranging effort to bring camas back to the landscape. All right, so I was just talking about oaks, and so I will tell you a little bit more about their importance. So obviously, acorns were something that would be something we could harvest each year, and like I said, we would essentially engineer these savannas where oaks could grow and flourish and bring us as much you know, product as possible, essentially. And when you think about an acorn and you think about its value for like storage and stuff, you're talking about, you know, protein and fats. It's like brain food, especially you know, in these kinds of foraging environments, proteins and fats are difficult to locate. So acorns are a, you know, a really important food source. And actually, I have always wondered this, and you know, whenever I would see a mortar and pestle in a museum, no matter what community, I would be like, whose job was it to carry that around? Because they're freaking heavy. And if you've ever, I mean, even when you get at the store, they're heavy. But the mortar and pestles that Five Oaks has in its archives are massive. And I learned that actually we would bury these bowls and pestles at the foot of a tree. So we would bury them at the oaks, and each year come back to the same tree and be able to dig up our mortar and pestle, process the acorns, and then bury them and come back to them next year. So that kind of also points to our relationship with the land and how intimate our relationship was with the trees, that, you know, we could literally bury something there and know we could come back and get it each year, and that was done generation over generation. And you know, these oaks were not only home to trade for indigenous people, but once Oregon was colonized, became a trade spot as well for settlers. So you know, the oaks are a sort of magnetic place, and you know, represent abundance, I think, for many communities. All right, so one of the other resources that's really important, and I think actually its season is a little bit later than the camas, but probably soon though, Wapato, which is, or Wapatu, depending on who you ask. Some tribes on the Pacific Northwest coast call it Wapatu. Some of us call it Wapato. So either one is acceptable, but It is a beautiful broad-leafed plant that grows sort of in the shallow waters of lakes or ponds, and it has a bulb at the bottom that is basically like a potato. And so we would harvest these plants just like the camas each year, and store these. We would roast them. Some tribes would boil them, but they had starch, which is a great sort of food in terms of like getting your carbohydrates and whatnot. So these became an important staple of the region, and that these would be something that people from Canada would trade for. So it is like a sort of regional delicacy, and we still harvest them today. Actually, we have a place in Gaston, Oregon. It's that used to be called, well, it used to be a lake, and it's not a lake anymore, but it's called Wapato Lake. And it was originally where we would overwinter as a tribe. So this is like sort of this beautiful temperate area of the Willamette Valley where you wouldn't see a ton of snow. And once it was, when it was a lake, it was a beautiful wetlands where you'd have, lots of animals, and also the Wapato would grow at the edge of the lake as well. And so you just had this like abundant resource, and it was a place where we would stay. We actually built our longhouses here. And so when we were originally trying to negotiate for a reservation with the federal government, we asked for the area around Wapato Lake to be our reservation, but they denied that and sent us out to Grand Ronde. And so, Grand Ronde, we call it the Grand Ronde Confederation. It's actually a confederation of 30 bands and tribes from around Washington, California, and Oregon. And Grand Ronde does not actually have a tribe itself. There is no Grand Ronde tribe. It's just a conglomeration of people who were sort of brought to one place because the government decided to round us all up and put us there. So Wapato Lake remains a very important place for the tribal community, and it actually is now a national preserve. And so we're working with the federal government to restore it back to its former glory. So it's very exciting. And I'm very proud to be from the Confederation of Grand Ronde because they're doing so much work to restore the landscape in Oregon to, what it was prior to settlement and agriculture. So it's a very exciting time to be alive and be part of this tribe. All right, so another important material, obviously the red cedar, or cedars generally, yellow cedar as well. Canoes, our pole houses, we use cedar for all kinds of things in our daily lives. We also just harvested the bark of the cedar. We use the bark. You can actually take the inner bark off of the tree without harming it, and you can essentially harvest it each year without harming the growth of the tree. And so we use that to make everything from hats to clothing and shoes and baskets. So cedar is a very important part of our life. It also is like it's repels bugs, so it's great for keeping things in, and yeah, it's just like such an important part of our life, and the way that we orient ourselves to the world is through the trees. And so yeah, trees have such an important part in our lives, like I was talking about with the oaks. It's like we're very much, our lives are informed by the trees. Here's a image of a pole house. This would be what a traditional pole house would have looked like. This is actually a Chinook pole house in Washington. And they're usually about, 3 bus lengths long. In the traditional sense, they would have been a place where people live multiple families, like, maybe 5, 6, 7 families in one of these. This image is of a pole house, and a contemporary pole house. So it doesn't look the same as it would have. There probably would have been partitions and different furniture. But the one thing that definitely remains the same is the hearth in the center. This would be where you would be roasting fish, or repairing your baskets and speaking with other families in the, in the band. And so as you can see, this would be a great place to be in the wintertime. It would be much more enjoyable than, being exposed to the elements. And so yeah, the pole house is an important part of Pacific Northwest tribal culture. Another material that's really important to the Pacific Northwest tribes, which is funny because it doesn't come from this area. It actually comes from a specific island up there in Vancouver, BC. It comes from one specific place, and this is the dentalium shell. It's a mollusk. And this was used essentially as money all in this region for a very long time. It's sort of become over harvested, unfortunately. It's much more rare these days than it was back in the time when this image of this young lady was taken. So as you can see, she has a lot of dentalium on her. And so that is a sign of the times. And she was likely from an affluent family. She obviously had a lot of money. So enough money to just wear it all over her. So I have actually a dentalium medallion that I wear. That's these little tiny pieces. As you can see, they're barely bigger than my fingernail compared to the ones that she's wearing because of the over harvesting of these mollusks. So anyway, it tells you a little bit about anything can be money, even just literally the shell of something hanging out in the ocean. So but they remain important, and you'll see them even on contemporary native regalia in this region. This is a sort of a famous illustration called the Kalapuyan Man, and it was done prior to Lewis and Clark coming to the region. And I like to share this image just because it tells you a little bit about how metropolitan the Kalapuyans actually were. So he's wearing a few different objects that give you different hints about who he would have likely interacted with in his daily life. The first dead giveaway is his shoes. He has clearly met an Englishman or a Frenchman, somebody from Europe, and he traded those shoes for something because they're obviously not a traditional shoe that we would have made. They're not a cedar shoe. So that tells you that he likely, maybe met somebody from the Hudson Bay, fur trappers coming from Canada. They were in the region in Oregon and Washington. So maybe that's who he traded with. He's also got a seal skin quiver for his bow and arrow, and seals weren't necessarily something that Kalapuyans would have been hunting for. So maybe he traded with somebody from the Clatsop Chinook tribes out towards the coast, but he would have been interacting with somebody who was likely from the coast as opposed to the interior. And he also has elk hat and robe on. And so elk is not something that Kalapuyans would have hunted either. So likely it would have been maybe a tribe from across the river towards Mount Hood, or maybe another coastal tribe, but tells you that he's definitely out and about, meeting people, trading for cooler, clothes and stuff. So the Pacific Northwest was very much an active region for trade way before Lewis and Clark came, because the French Canadians had been there for much longer. And so there is this sense that the region was isolated in some way prior to Lewis and Clark, but it definitely was not, and that it was actually quite active here between many different cultures. All right, so this next piece is from the exhibition, and it's by an artist named Derek Lavore. He's from the Modoc tribe, and he has taken what is a cow skull and painted what I originally was like, is this a watermelon? It's not, though. It's meant to represent a trout or a salmon. And he is talking about a similar idea that Angelica talked about in her piece about this idea of walking in two worlds. And so he explains this piece. One side of my family relied on work from the farms, and the other side are members of the Klamath tribe. I understand the agony of both over dam removal. So, something that I talked about earlier is this idea of walking two worlds, where it's balancing the reality of non-native life and native life. And Derek really sort of sums it up in this way that I think encapsulates, like, yeah, we have family from all different walks of life, and we have family that work in agriculture that will be impacted by dam removal, but we also have tribal families who will be positively impacted by dam removal. And so it's this duality that we live in, and that I think many of us are constantly trying to balance and grapple with, because we actually do want to find balance and understanding. And so and that's why there is a sort of tension, I think, because we do want to honor all sides, and sometimes that can be really difficult. All right, so the next area of the exhibition is where things get juicier, and it's more about colonization and the history, the broken treaties. The original Grand Ronde Reservation was essentially, like, I think it was like 60,000 acres promised, and within just about, I think it was like 80 years, that had been reduced down to 5 acres through things like the Dawes Act, where, they just started giving away our land to settlers to develop the area. And so, treaties were not really ever honored, and we're still trying to get back, get back our land and remain stewards of it. And so the treaties are a sort of sensitive topic for many of us. But there are these panels that are included in the exhibition, which are about, the things that happened during colonization. And sort of my work in changing these timelines was to sort of reprioritize the information, because the exhibition was originally created by people who are like, anthropologists. And so they prioritize things like, first settler coming on the Oregon Trail. And it's like, well, that's not really important to tribal people. What was a problem is when they started, wanting to round us up and put us in reservations and stuff. So it wasn't the first settler that made us that was important. And so thinking about sort of reprioritizing the information throughout the exhibition, these timeline panels have a lot of edits that are basically from David, our historian, and I really had to work with him to make sure I got this stuff right, because I'm an expert only so far. He is one of the world's experts. So definitely made sure I incorporated his voice into this, so that our voice as a tribe was heard, because we're just not seen as experts on our story. We're not seen as people who can tell our story. We're telling myths, and so it was important that our voice be prioritized in this exhibition. And just zooming in on the panels, you can see I basically pasted over the top of stuff. And again, if you want to see these close up, please go to Pittock Mansion so you can see all the edits and read the different details, and sort of, then also makes you wonder about why this stuff was left out in the first place when it was made. The final panels that I think are the most important of the exhibition are about the Indian boarding school that was originally built in Forest Grove, Oregon, and then moved to Salem about 4 or 5 years later. So it was built in 1880. It actually is the oldest running Indian boarding school in the country. It remains open today. It's 125 years old. And this was a place where Indian children were essentially forced away from their families and, assimilated, taught to speak English, taught not to speak their own tongues, cut their hair, made them change their clothes, learn to be good Christians and serve their white masters, essentially. And so these schools, at almost every single one of them in the US and in Canada, there are grave sites. I don't know many schools that have cemeteries, but all of these did. And it's because, children were abused and neglected. And so Oregon has its own unique history along with the, Indian boarding school system. It literally the second one in the country. So it's sort of like a testing ground for these things. And, the descendants of, including myself, I'm a descendant of someone who went to these schools, and the pain that carries on through the generations is real. And that while these, times may be over, they really do still impact our community in real palpable ways. Here's an image from the very first students who ever went to the Indian boarding school in Forest Grove, and a picture of them just about 7 months later. As you can see, they have changed a great deal. Their hair has changed, their clothes has changed. There's also a child missing because, within just 7 months of being in the care of, the government, the military, we already had one child lost. And so, these pictures were taken actually to sell to people so that they would support them financially, getting white people to support the assimilation of the Indian. And so these are like, cosmopolitan before and after pics, but they're actually like very painful for Indigenous people to see because, these children were being abused and in many cases actually passed away. So, this is a painful era of Oregon's own history that many people don't know about. All right, with all of that being said, I like to just sort of end on a positive note, which is that I am so proud to be from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde because my community is doing so many things, and we are federally recognized. So we're one of 562 federally recognized tribes in the US. There are over 1,000 that are not recognized, but I'm so proud of my tribe for using their sovereignty to improve not only the lives of their members, but the lives of Oregonians and just like the broader community. It's just like so beautiful. So many investments in, with the Spirit Mountain Community Fund. We fund the Rose, parade each year, but we're also doing things like restoring Willamette Falls and restoring Wapato Lake and all these really beautiful things contributing to our community in ways that, sort of continue the legacy of Indigenous land stewardship in Oregon. And so I'm proud to be a part of that. And with that, I will stop talking. And if there are questions, I would love to answer them.
Do you need a breather or a bio break or anything, Steph?
Oh, no, I'm good.
All right, so if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. In the meantime, I have a couple of notes that I took on my own and questions as folks are percolating on the information that you provide us. So first of all, Steph, thank you so much. I love the detail that you went into each of the panels and the individual artist pieces. I also really love your stories about the oaks, and I think that burying those mortal and pestles is kind of genius. And I also loved your point that so many of these ecologically healthy lands are engineered and are managed by humans. So first off, this is a question that I received by email from a high school student. What advice do you have for Native graphic novelists / illustrators trying to break into the comic / book industry?
That's a great question because I just did that myself in just the last 2 years. So one thing is social media, Instagram. They just did a poll recently about how people find artists, and 44% of the responders said Instagram. So and I can say that I owe my career to Instagram. I have nearly 30,000 followers, and I've just sort of built a following that way. So I really encourage people to start documenting their work and putting it on the internet to share and hashtagging it so people can find them.
Are there any particular hashtags?
Well, it depends on the kind of artist you are, but if you're someone who's an indigenous artist, hashtag indigenous art, Native American art, things like that. Because if you're an illustrator and you're Native and that's your angle, they will find you. The publishing houses use Instagram. That's how I'm working with Simon & Schuster right now. That's how they found me. So it's just really making yourself findable. So if you want to be known as an indigenous graphic artist, then you just need to start hashtagging indigenous art and sharing your graphic novel art,
That's great advice. Thank you. A question from the chat. Can you tell us a little bit more about the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibit at the Pittock Mansion and how long it'll be there?
Yeah, so the Pittock Mansion show is open right now, and so you can view the exhibition. It's on view if you go up to the mansion. You can go into the mansion and see the whole thing, or you can, go see the show and then go see the mansion. But anyway, it's open until July 23rd, and it's a beautiful space in there. It's really cool to just take up space because the original creator of the Pittock Mansion is he started the Oregonian, and he also did not like native people all that much. So taking up space in his house is very exciting for me. And also there's just some really beautiful native art. So if you've ever been curious about what contemporary native artists are doing, it's a good place to get started.
Awesome. So I just want to bring up, so the previously existing exhibit on the Kalapuyan peoples, it sort of demonstrated this distance that the original curators had with the people they were trying to represent. And as you mentioned, your work of like the editing and retelling was a bold act and kind of like a no-no. So do you have any advice for like Native individuals who are attempting a similar act of reclamation?
Yeah, I think you just have to be a truth teller. And I think that's really what it is. Like, it's not a magical thing that I do. It's just me being honest. And I think that's something that can be refreshing in a world where the reason why we have all of these problems is because nobody really wants to talk about stuff, And so for me, I'm just happy to ask questions and get to the bottom of it. And so, if you're going to be in this world, then you just have to be sort of courageous in a way, because sometimes people don't like it when you ask questions or tell the truth. But if you want to make work that makes impact, then you have to be willing to sort of take those risks.
A question from Paul Gordon in the chat asks, so they recently read about the renaming of Swastika Mountain to Halo Mountain. And then as a Native person, what do you think about the renaming of local landmarks, buttes, etc., that are originally named after colonizers?
Great question, though, because actually that's David Lewis that worked on the show. He's the one who petition to change the name to Halo Mountain. And so that is so cool to me, because obviously, like, why would we ever have Swastika Mountain? But Oregon has its own crazy history with white supremacy. So I'm like, okay, cool, let's get rid of that. I think that, naming things after the local indigenous people is like a really beautiful way to honor us symbolically. It doesn't do a whole lot for individual Native people, but it is cool to see things like that, where something that Swastika Mountain is just the most grotesque thing I had ever seen in terms of naming the land. As a person who does connect to the land, I just think, why would you put something so hateful on the name of a mountain? So anyway, I think it's beautiful, and we should do more of those things.
Yeah, I just recently learned about a park in Portland that was Custer Park and was recently renamed, and it took forever.
Good.
Some of them are more nuanced than Swastika Mountain, but yeah, names have meaning. They aren't just arbitrary. So Stephanie Smith in the chat asks, I enjoy reading nonfiction works by Native people. Is there a good resource for finding those authors?
Oh man, I mean, if you just Google indigenous authors, you'll find a ton. But I was gonna say, if you haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass, I highly recommend that book. It's written by an indigenous scientist. And so the book is so beautiful because it really talks about how indigenous knowledge can really inform science and empiricism. And so we're not as far apart as we think we are. And so anyway, there are lots of nonfiction Native writers and people writing about all different kinds of things in the culture. If you just Google, you will be on your way.
We also have a question about, so there's a neighborhood in Lake Oswego, the Westlake neighborhood, and that neighborhood is home to some large stands of Oregon white oaks that the Watershed Council is actually working to enhance. And This person wanted to know if they live in the Westlake area, are they living in Kalapuyan Land? And it would it be Tualatin? Well,
I
Kalapuyan.
believe so. Let me just go. I'm just gonna double check the Westlake area on that map I was actually showing you guys. I believe that it is Kalapuyan Land. It's likely, yeah, I think it might be Tualatin, which would be, or Otfalati, which is what we call ourselves. But it also could be the Clackamas Kalapuyan. But I honestly, the band we all kind of went all over the place. Like I was saying, this sort of idea of cosmopolitanness. So our, territories overlapped here and there.
Thanks, Steph. How can descendants of Oregon pioneers be better allies to indigenous people today?
I think being a better ally generally is, no matter what it is like starting with education. So starting with things like tonight, taking a little bit of time out of our crazy days to learn about someone else is like a huge way to boost empathy and just enable you to walk in the world each day like a little bit more enlightened to other people's sort of struggles, I think, and so being an ally really starts with education more than anything, because you can't really change anything until you know how to be an ally, and that means understanding the needs of a community. And I think the biggest problem that I have with folks who like want to be allies is that they put the cart before the horse, and it's like you can't offer something to a community if you don't actually know what they need. And so learning about community and connecting with that community however you can in your own region is the first step. So I highly recommend looking at David's website. David, the historian, I'll actually put his website in the chat for you guys. He shares his academic writings for free. So if you want to learn about indigenous sort of life in the Pacific Northwest region, you can just dive into his website and kind of start wherever you like. You can type in keywords, even if it's like you want to know about your specific city, it might have something in there. So anyway, I just shared the link in the chat, but it is he's continually adding to it. He's constantly doing stuff. So it's a great website if you want to just start kind of learning about the region.
Thank you for including that link. And David's website I love because it's like a blog. He writes like these things like they're a blog. They're very anecdotal, and they aren't academic or inaccessible in any way. They're just very kind of read like his thoughts, which is really nice.
He does have some of his academic writings on there though. So if you want to read like his old thesis papers and stuff, like it's a very deep archives.
Okay, so one more question for you, and then we will let you go. So you one of the themes you bring up in your presentation a few times is this idea of walking between two worlds, like between native and non-native. I was wondering, do you think there is a dual relationship between art and science?
Oh yeah. I love that question so much. I actually was a NOAA fellow for 2000 and 2001. So I worked with scientists at NOAA Fisheries in Sacramento and basically help them bring their research to life in a way that would help educate the public. And so for me, art and science, like they should be besties, because scientists don't really know how to like share their research with people, because they're really good at the research part but not so great at the communication part of it. And so because I love to read like scientific journals and stuff, I will read their stuff and then make work in response to it that educates people. And so I think that art and science need to come together more and more, because we can enlighten people faster that way. So yeah, I think they go together, and that we should be trying to get together even more in the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Steph. This has been such a gift, and we are so blessed to have you speak to us. And yeah, good luck to you on all your endeavors. You can visit the This is Kalapuyan Land exhibit at Pittock Mansion. And yeah, thank you. I will end this here. Look out for the recording. Bye, everyone.